Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mental Architecture Building the Mind One Moment at a Time. I'm Howard Blumenfeld, and I'm the author of the book, which is available exclusively on Amazon. Today's episode is going to be about how labels are dangerous. And so these go from basically any names that you call a person, whether it's pejorative or not. Labels can definitely conjure up a lot of harmful attitudes and actions towards people. Now, I want to start out by saying that some labels are necessary and important. We've talked about this before with, being in the workplace. It's important to know who your boss is, and it's important to know what your role is in that place. And then other labels are descriptive, but not necessarily discriminatory in any kind of way. I'm a father. You might be a mother, brother, sister. So these kinds of labels are not dangerous. But there are categories of labels that definitely can influence people in a negative way. And one of the terms that has been probably amongst the most controversial that I can remember is people who are labeled as disabled. And just the word disability even, can make people feel like there's something really wrong with them, and it can make others feel like there's something wrong with that person. And that's really not fair. But there's that word exists. And so I'd like to get into what the definition of disability is. So according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the disability is a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition that impairs, interferes with, or limits a person's ability to engage in certain tasks or actions or participate in typical daily activities and interactions. This definition is substantiated by the American Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which was passed in 1990. So while there has to be a definition for disability, it's unfortunate what connotations and microaggressions have come out of it. So the American Disabilities Act was passed because people who were disabled didn't have the same rights. In a lot of ways, they still don't, as their counterparts who are not disabled. So there's a lot of stories of people who have been and who are still being ridiculed because of their disabilities. And it's really unfortunate because nobody knows what it's like to experience a personal deficit like that unless they've had it themselves. So there's a story that's in my book of this insurance salesman who had kneecaps that would spontaneously dislocate. And he had this really large walking stick that he would use. And his coworkers would make fun of him all the time for it and even take his stick from him just because they thought it was funny. And his boss wasn't even understanding of him. He would show up to work late because of this disability. He couldn't control what happened with his kneecaps. And his boss would just show him nothing but, ridicule. And I think that's really unfortunate that things like this happen. But that label of disabled, unfortunately, carries across connotations to other people. And I don't really know why people act in a negative way towards people who have that label. But I think it has to do with fear. I think, if you go back to microaggressions, it's exactly the same thing. That label may conjure up some kind of fear in an able-bodied person. And I'm not sure exactly what those fears would necessarily be. But obviously in that situation with the insurance salesman, there was something going on to where the people around him felt like they needed to pick on him to make themselves feel better. So obviously they were really insecure. And in another situation, people who have these labels can be hard on themselves. It's not just other people being hard on them, but sometimes they can actually be hard on themselves. And that's not really a microaggression in that situation, but it's more of an issue of self-esteem. And it certainly can be perpetuated by the microaggressions that are levied onto them. So another example in my book that I talk about is an author named Carla. And Carla, she has a disability where she's confined to a wheelchair. And, she talks about how that disability makes her feel overly reliant on others. It makes her feel guilty when she needs to ask for help. And she just feels less adequate. And she talks about a really disappointing and depressing experience in the realm of dating. And I don't think any of us would understand this unless we've been there. But she said every time she posts an online picture of herself, she's really pretty. So people would, accept her as a match. And then when they found out that she was disabled, she just suddenly stopped hearing back from people. So she experienced that shallowness. And I think that that just reinforced her to be even harder on herself. And so that's an area where that label, again, is dangerous, not only to be other people's perception of her, but to her own perception of herself. And that's something I don't think that people think about it a lot, is how what they say to people in the context of a label or an identification affects that person psychologically. So we have a little bit of a conundrum. Having a label such as disabled creates the stigma, both for the individual and for insensitive people around them. And we could say, well, why don't we get rid of that label altogether and just stop calling these people disabled? And I think a great argument could be made for that, because just because somebody has some kind of physical impairment or mental impairment does not mean at all that they're incapable of supporting themselves or supporting society in a meaningful way. That is absolutely false. And it's unfortunate that they're subject to being excluded because of that. And I even see this at my work sometimes, when we have to make accessible PDFs. You hear somebody say, well, how many students are really going to need that? That is being, again, insensitive. Who cares how many students need it? The fact is that somebody needs it, and we need to be able to provide and meet those needs. So the term disability is necessary from a pragmatic standpoint to make sure that people with disabilities get their legal rights and accommodations. But at the same time, having that label makes it problematic. So I think it's important to revisit these words and to revisit these connotations, and maybe to come up with new labels. I'm not going to tell you that I have a label to replace the term disabled, but I don't like the word disabled. Just its very word itself is implying that that person can't do something, and psychologically training them into thinking that, when, like I said, we know that's not the case. Everybody brings something to the table, and we should focus on what their abilities are. We all have abilities, and we all have certain disabilities. But calling somebody disabled and referring to them in that way can definitely be a huge damper on their own self-esteem and confidence. So we definitely need to change that, and we need to create labels that are a lot more neutral and don't have connotations that this person can't do something. And so I think that is a challenge, but it's a necessary one to take. And I think reforming people's ideas and thoughts about certain labels is also equally important. Educating them, and also educating people who experience disabilities not to be too hard on themselves. And so if you think of one of the most iconic individuals with a disability, unfortunately, he passed away recently, that would be Stephen Hawking, who presumably had ALS his entire life and outlived many doctors' expectations for how long he would be able to live and function. And he made great contributions to physics and astronomy, was a popular science figure. And I really like this quote that he said in the later stages of his life. I'd like to share it with you. My advice to other disabled people would be concentrate on things your disability doesn't prevent you doing well, and don't regret the things it interferes with. Don't be disabled in spirit as well as physically. I think as a society, we have to keep working on developing innovative and creative accommodations for people so that they don't have to feel that they're disabled, and they feel like they can enjoy the same activities as able-bodied individuals. And if we can do more of that, then I feel like we won't really need to call these people disabled anymore. We can say that they have physical limitations. Why can't we just say that? That is a fact. That is absolutely true. They do have physical limitations, but those limitations are neutral. There's nothing wrong with them because they have those limitations. It is our job as their peers to give them the resources necessary so that they can participate in the activities that they want to do. I'd like to turn my attention from that label to another label, which is mental health. And you often hear people calling other people crazy. I know I've been called crazy or weird or unusual. And this kind of, circles back to the whole no normal topic of my chapter, which is what really does it mean to be of sound mental health? And so if you think back 100, 200 years, the field of psychology did not really exist. And not that long ago, people were being burned at the stake for acting in a certain way that was deemed to be abnormal or crazy by others. And people with epilepsy were considered to be possessed by demons, and they were exorcised at best, and at worst, they were killed and or locked up in insane asylums. Is that really a good way to treat people just because their brain functions in a way differently than others? And that personally makes me very angry. So, fast forward 200 years to where we are now, we're in a much better place with mental health awareness than we've ever been, I think, as a society, despite being in the middle of a pandemic, which definitely is going to take a toll and has taken a toll on people's mental health. But even so, there are more resources now available to people than there ever have been. So I will say that, the best therapists are the ones who don't label their patients and tell them you have this condition. Because again, automatically it conjures up some kind of mental limitation in your mind of the person and of the way people will treat you. You go and tell somebody you have bipolar depression, they really, unless they need to know that, like if they're a close relative or friend, or, there's a justifiable reason why you need to tell people that, there's no reason you have to go around saying that, because what that's going to do is encourage people to treat you differently. And, I'm not saying you shouldn't ever tell people that, but it really should be an individual choice. I feel like therapy should be very careful about those gray areas. So right now in modern psychology, we have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders, or the DSM, and it's been through many iterations. We're on the fifth iteration now, DSM-5. And if you look at old editions of the DSM, they were very much focused on categorizing and labeling people, schizophrenia, bipolar depression, and so on and so forth. But what I'm really encouraged by and happy to see is a movement away from that in the more modern editions of DSM into a spectrum-based dimension, where instead of saying that person has autism or that person has Asperger's syndrome, you say that person is on the autism spectrum, meaning that they have certain characteristics and traits that are from that spectrum, but they are not defined by their autism. And so I think that's very nice to have a spectrum of variability, to say that we really can't fit these people into this box and label them in this way. And this kind of, gets back to the idea that everybody really is individual and different. 10 people who have autism are not going to express it all 10 people are not going to express it in the same way. They're going to express it differently, because autism doesn't express itself the same way with every single person. And so the same is true of many other mental health conditions. And even calling them disorders, once again, it's kind of like disability. Yes, a lot of mental health issues are indeed neurological and psychological disorders, in the sense that, one's brain is having maybe a disordered neurochemical imbalance, but we really shouldn't think of them societally as disorders, because these people can be really creative. And I'm going to talk about this in later videos. And we really just need to focus on, because you have this chemical imbalance, this career or this type of situation might not be the easiest for you. But if you want to do that, maybe there's medications we can give you to help you get there, along with some therapy, or we can help you find what passion best suits your personality and your skills. You have a limitation, but that limitation is only confined to certain areas of your life. And we definitely need to address those. But by keeping the word disorder out of it, at least to the person, for medical reasons, you may have to put that down, as a diagnosis, but it really helps the person to feel more confident, and what, focus also on what positive character, every condition has positive and negative characteristics. And when I was actually writing my book, if you watched my earlier video on aphantasia is characterized by the inability to to experience mental imagery and to basically experience the mind's eye and imagine things in a visual kind of way. I was posting on my Instagram about it, and somebody said to me, "I don't really like that you call aphantasia a disorder." This is somebody who had it, and they said, "I really prefer if you use the word characteristic." And so I rewrote parts of my book to reflect that, because they preferred to think of it as a characteristic. They didn't want to feel limited by their inability to visualize imagery. So I think it's very important the way that we word things, the way we frame things, because that contextualizes how people are going to react to those labels and what they're going to do with their lives because of it. So I want to conclude this video by just encouraging you to think about the labels that you use with people around you in your family, your friends, people you encounter all the time. And these don't have to be the labels I talked about in this video. These could include racial labels, religious labels, you name it. And I want you to think and kind of mentally exercise with the idea of changing those labels. How would you change those? Can you think of something other than the word disability to describe somebody who has a physical limitation? Can you think of something other than the word disorder to characterize somebody who has a mental health limitation? It's just food for thought. I don't have all the answers, but we're going to continue this discussion next week. The topic is advancements in mental health awareness, a perfect way to transition from this video. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you've had a chance to see the other videos in my series, which, this video series is not meant to just be a summary of the different chapters and sections of my book, but it is intended to also kind of encourage you to think differently about all kinds of different topics. So watching this YouTube video series is great if you've already read my book or if you're reading my book, but you don't have to have my book, and you certainly don't have to read my book to enjoy the YouTube series. But I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel. Just click on the subscribe button right now and then ring the bell. Like and comment if you have anything you'd like to say. And I look forward to seeing you back here again next week when I do another video. So I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you very much for listening.